The FortePiano I'm playing in the rehearsals and performance of the Kegelstadt was made by Paul McNulty in Amsterdam in 1987. It's a copy of a Viennese instrument made by Anton Walter in round about 1795, so slightly later than Mozart's own day, although Mozart owned a fortepiano of 5 octaves by Anton Walter, which he bought in 1782 or 1783. It was an instrument that he absolutely loved and which he transported regularly from his apartment in Vienna to concert halls and to intimate salons, and which he used in all of his known performances of his chamber music, of his solo piano music, and of his piano concertos in Vienna during the 1780s. What I'm sat at the moment is a wonderful Michael Rosenberger 5.5 octave fortepiano, built round about 1800, perhaps just a little bit earlier, in the Finchcock's collection of historical keyboard instruments here in Goudhurst in Kent. It's an instrument very different in design from a modern Steinway. A modern Steinway has much more metal in it because of the hugely greater tension of the strings, which of course cover a wider octave range of over 7 octaves, and which was an instrument built essentially for an entirely different purpose from the sonatas and trios of Mozart. It's a huge instrument designed to make a massive sound and carry in a large concert hall above a full-size orchestra. That's not the sound that Mozart had in mind. He had a much more cleanly profiled sound in his head. There isn't a particular fortepiano sound to be linked with Mozart. The fortepiano was an instrument in massive development, experimental development during his lifetime, and there were several different species that he knew about. The one that he owned, and indeed this one, share something of a common ancestry. Mozart's was built by the Viennese maker Gabriel Anton Walter, one of whose pupils is thought to have been Michael Rosenberger, the builder of this instrument. You'll notice that the tail end of the instrument is squared off, which is a feature of the later Viennese style of instrument, such as was built by Walter. Earlier types, by Stein for instance, of Augsburg, whose pianos Mozart encountered in the late 1770s and which he greatly appreciated, have a double S-shaped bend along the side, and whereas this instrument is double strung from the bass up to B, just almost an octave above middle C, and from there to the top is treble strung to give a little bit more sound. The Stein was typically double strung throughout, but Stein's instruments, as well as Walter's, as well as Rosenberger's, were not standard models. Each of those makers built according to a range of different specifications, whether that's to do with the precise point at which the stringing goes from double to treble, or whether it's to do with the size and shape and coverage of the very tiny hammers inside the instrument which hit the strings, or whether it's to do with the way in which sounds are modulated. On this instrument, for instance, I have a couple of knee levers hidden away under the keyboard, the right one of which, if I press it upwards, brings forwards towards me a row of cloth tongs which intervene between the hammers and the strings and produce a more veiled sound. There are a number of different mechanisms which Stein and Walter and Rosenberger used for sound effects of that sort. The keyboard itself is laid out very much like a modern instrument, although the precise dimensions of the black keys in relation to the white keys somewhat different, the black keys being a little bit thinner, still grouped of course in threes and in twos. But the most fundamental visual difference with a keyboard of this date is that actually the colours are the opposite way round. The black keys in twos and threes are white and the normal white keys are black. The octaves ranges are 5.5 from low F up to treble C up there. We have a knee lever operated damper rail. When I raise my left knee on the left lever, what happens is that this rail lifts off and all of the strings are free to vibrate in that way. If I release the damper, then that is cut off. So that's an equivalent of the more modern pedal mechanism for operating the damper. The strings, which I'm looking along the length of at the moment, are very thin compared to the copper overwound strings on a modern Steinway. They also run in parallel along the length of the instrument with the grain of the soundboard. And that means several things. I'll pick out two. On a modern Steinway, there is cross stringing, the bass strings going diagonally across the instrument and actually covering some of the stringing for the higher registers of the instrument, and to a certain extent therefore clouding the production of the tone. Here everything is open to the elements, as it were, and what that means is that the registers, bass, treble and middle, are all rather different in their character. So the instrument is naturally quite colourful. A second thing that it means is that when I actually play a chord, for instance, all of the elements of it are crystal clear. The texture is very clear. So if I were to play a standard classical texture which has Alberti bass figures in it, there is no sense in which the left-hand part clouds the right hand. I don't have to overbalance the right hand in order to be heard over the left, which I would need to do to a certain extent on a modern Steinway type grand piano. And that affects the way that texture is developed by Mozart in writing for the keyboard instrument. He was keenly aware of the aural possibilities of this instrument and wrote his textures in such a way that all of the elements of the polyphony can be clearly heard. I'll just illustrate how one note operates in the middle of the register. What we have there is an immediacy of pitch attack instead of, on a modern Steinway, a percussive beginning and an immediate thereafter blooming into a very beautiful bell-shaped sound which decays over time. Here we have an absolutely immediate onset of the pitch but a very rapid decay of the pitch. That also contributes to the cleanness of the texture and the clarity of the polyphony that it's possible to capture within that, not simply with the FortePiano on its own, but in an ensemble setting as well. So whereas in some modern performances of the Kegelstadt trio, there are textures where if the left hand, for instance, is relatively busy or in a relatively low register played on modern instruments, both the clarinet and the viola are sometimes fighting to be heard across that texture from the piano. In a period instrument setting, you never encounter that kind of difficulty. You can play creatively what Mozart wrote in the sure and certain knowledge that the textures are going to work. I've mentioned something about the sound production, something about the special effects that the instrument can capture, whether that's the damper mechanism or the moderator mechanism. One other thing to mention is the shallowness of the key dip. When I play the keys here, I've almost no distance to travel before the sound is activated, unlike on a modern Steinway where there is a considerable depth of millimetres to be travelled vertically before any sound emerges from the instrument. That allows me to play continuous semiquaver textures in a relatively effortless way. And so on from the last movement of the Kegelstadt. The crispness of attack on each of those notes allows for a beautiful pearly sound to emerge. Mozart himself wrote that those passages ought to flow like oil, which on an instrument of this kind and calibre they certainly do. One final thing to mention about the sound production of this is the mechanism of the instrument, which is hidden away out of view here to a certain extent, but each of the individual key levers for this instrument has sat on it within the belly of the instrument its own hammer, which means that I have an immediacy of sensation connecting my physical playing of the keys and the onset of the sound. For instance, if I were to play this little extract from the slow movement of the C major sonata K330, which Mozart wrote in 1782 or thereabouts, the repeated notes that you'll hear in a moment in the left hand, I can control very, very carefully and in a finely graded way, precisely because of the way in which the hammer is set onto the key lever itself and its very carefully regulated escapement. And all of that is a physical or mechanical characteristic which Mozart exploits to great expressive effect. Each time I repercuss one of those notes, I have a direct physical connection between the sensation of depressing each key and the onset of the sound, and that is because the hammer is set directly onto the key lever. There is almost no mechanism intervening between my depressing of the key and the onset of the sound, which again gives a very close sense of involvement with the physical production of Mozart's music in a way that a modern Steinway simply does not allow.